let's start in a slightly foofier way. Because to me, actually, the sciencey stuff is really interesting, and I'll spend a lot of time on that. But there are really important implications for me personally, and I think for a lot of people that hear me talk about this stuff, that's often reflected back at me. So Bob Thurman made reference yesterday morning to, in Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, the idea that what we are trying to cultivate in practice is, on the one hand, wisdom, and on the other hand, compassion. And what's meant by wisdom is seeing reality for what it is, not through colored glasses, not the delusional stuff we think, the delusional stuff such as we are separate from each other, et cetera, et cetera. And so, majority of what I've been presenting is about the nature of reality. It's the wisdom component, and I'm going to spend most of the talk talking about that. But by the end, that has implications for the compassion part, and so we'll return to that. So what is the nature of existence, and how do we see that clearly? And what I'm presenting is a scheme that arose in the context of my work that seems to have illuminated some of that and is useful for people. You've heard many different schemes for understanding the nature of reality, and in this conference, many of them overlap with each other significantly, which is part of the significance. Even though we're all coming from very different backgrounds and have very different languages, or sometimes just subtly different languages to describe it, we're often describing the same stuff. So this is my version of this. It's neither right nor wrong, it's just my version, and if there's something useful, then there's something useful for you. Oh, I did include, okay, so basically what I tried to establish upstairs is that one aspect of the nature of reality that is really inarguable, no one will contradict me on this, though they won't want to follow me in terms of the implications. There's no scientist I've ever met who says, no, this is crazy. You have the vacuum, space-time, an energy-rich field. So we used to think of vacuums as empty, but it turns out they're not. And because it's an energy-rich field, E equals mc squared, in complementarity, I like that word, gives rise to the quantum foam, the smallest things, whatever those are. And string theorists would say they're strings. There are other theories. There's no agreement amongst physicists what those smallest things are. What they do agree on is that the next level up gets us into the standard model. And so this is, we're talking about quarks and gluons and et cetera, and that gets us up into subatomic particles like neutrons and protons, and that gets us into atoms, et cetera. Something I want to draw attention to, which I discussed briefly upstairs, is this role of randomness. So there's nothing in the world at any level of scale that in fact really works like a machine, except machines. But if you dig down into a machine, there's all sorts of stuff in a machine that's not machine-like. What I didn't talk about upstairs is what's the difference and how does this randomness work in the system. I described how there's this narrow window. Too much randomness, you get no self-organization. Too little randomness, you don't get any change, any potential for change. So that's not an adaptive system. It's not going to be a living system. But additionally, the other feature that's a key component of complex adaptive systems, adaptive being the key word, is that there has to be an overall balance of negative feedback loops and that are homeostatic as opposed to positive feedback loops. So a negative feedback loop is like an air conditioner. The room is warm, the air conditioner turns on, the room cools down, the air conditioner turns off, and so you're cycling within this homeostatic realm. It's not stable, but it's cycling. And so we've heard that word reappear over and over again in the last couple of days. A positive feedback loop would be you have a room that when it gets hotter, the heater turns on. And the hotter it gets, the more the heater turns on. And so it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. You can have those in a complex system, but they can't predominate. Think about when you get a fever. That's a positive feedback loop starting to predominate over the homeostatic loops. And there it has an adaptive capacity. So positive feedback loops aren't bad, but if they predominate, you can't sustain an adaptive self-organization. let's say you do have positive feedback loops. Can you get self-organization? You can. Think hurricanes, tornadoes. In cell biology, that would be what a cancer is. The negative feedback loops of normal cells have sort of fallen away, and the cells are now proliferating in a positive feedback loop. So the worse it gets, the worse it gets. But all of those are self-limited and energy expending. The cancer will kill you and kill itself in the process. Tornadoes come to an end, hurricanes peter out. So, but they are self-organizing, but they're not adaptive. They don't sustain themselves. So that's a really key component. So the idea that in these higher levels of scale, like for cells, we had to make an argument for where the randomness in the system is. And when we started talking about this, very strongly in cell biology, it was felt that a cell, when it divides, will always give rise to these two kinds of cells, period. A stem cell will always give rise to a replacement stem cell and the next cell in the lineage, period. The idea that actually there was some flexibility, that this was stochastic, meaning it was likely to do it that way, or it will do that way in terms of the whole population. But any individual stem cell, maybe a stem cell would give rise to two stem cells. Maybe a stem cell would give rise to two daughter cells. Maybe a stem cell would give rise to one and the other. And in the population, you would get the balance of 50%, 50%. That was really difficult to speak about just 15 years ago. Now that's easy to talk about. So paradigms really shift. But when we got down to the quantum realm, we know that it's based on probabilities. There is no machine-like processing. And that's inherent in the system. The mathematics of quantum mechanics provides for us that quench disorder in a very precise sort of way. So this disorder is throughout the whole system. Feedback loops are also embedded in the system at all levels of scale, allowing this to happen. And then we self-assemble the entire universe. That's easy. And as I described, different levels of scale are in complementarity to each other, and this is a part of what we think Bohr was intuiting, and we've written about that. We've used the word process, echoing Whitehead, and then this idea of recursion. And these three things map into many different traditions, tripartite descriptions of reality. That's linguistic detail I'm not going to provide for you today, but that's one of the interesting things about this, that when we started coming up with these things, Manas got very excited about, because this is important in Shaivism. Originally, we didn't call it process, we called it sentience. And this was me starting, this is how I met Manas. I was presenting this idea at a conference he was hosting. And he was like, we have to talk to each other. So the idea that sentience, as defined by Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana, if you've heard of the Mind and Life meetings, an organization that meets with the Dalai Lama, that was founded by Francisco Varela. And the reason it's called Mind and Life is because they defined the smallest unit of life is the cell. If it is alive, it has a mind. If it has mind, it's necessarily alive. And the smallest unit of that is the cell. And that's where the name of the organization came from. And they defined sentience roughly. This is a very thin paraphrase, because it's a highly technical book they wrote. Sensing the outside world, processing the information sensed internally within the system, within the cell, or within whatever thing we're talking about, and then responding to that. The key thing is that it's responding in a complex way internally, which means it's not a machine processing, it's not an air conditioner. There are potentials for randomness in there that may change the response from one moment to the next, from one action to the next. And so again, this is partly where adaptation comes into the system. So a classic example that they use is you have a paramecium swimming forward, and the way it swims, it's got these little hairs along the cell surface, and they're all stroking in unison, and it's moving forward. It bumps into a wall. The plasma membrane of the cell flattens. The calcium channels thereby open. Calcium flows from within the cell, outside the cell, and that wave of calcium makes the little hairs sweep in the other direction, and it backs up. The cell membrane restores, the calcium channels stop, close, and then water just carries those calcium ions away, and they start going forward again. What we see is a paramecium trying to get around an object. What's happening is this, but it looks like purposeful, conscious, sentient behavior. And what they were arguing is, it is sentient behavior, the smallest unit. My question was, is the cell really the lowest rung where you see that? And you can make an argument that you actually see that at the molecular level, at the atomic level, because all of them are sensing each other. Stu, you'd call that measurement. Particles can measure each other, they're observing each other, they're going to process the information they receive about the other thing they've encountered, and they will have a response. And we know in the quantum realm it is not machine-like. There's a range of possibilities, a range of potentials that have probabilities assigned to them. So it won't always be the same thing. None of this is machine-like. So I called that sentience all the way down. And Manas and I wrote our first paper together called Sentience Everywhere. People got very upset at the idea of the word sentience. This one people read. And they were like, that's ridiculous. A Google car is sentient? No, that's not what we're saying. So what we did was we then broke that up into three things. Okay, let's leave the words, because we realized that's just arguing about the word. We'll call it sentience at the biological level. Living things can be sentient. Below that, you have the same sort of process, and we're using Alfred North Whitehead's process here, which we don't have time for today, but he's worth looking into. Biomolecules and atoms are interacting with each other, and they are doing so creatively. They are giving rise to emergent structures. We won't call it sentience. We'll call it creative interactivity. And we can call it interactivity because these are relatively bounded structures that you can draw a circle around, and they're interacting with each other. There's a thing, and they interact. But once you get down into the quantum realm, there are no boundaries because of non-locality and entanglement, et cetera, et cetera. And so there, at the lowest level, we called it creative intraactivity. This is terminology for the geeks. And then we got to here, for all the reasons that I said. This was a diagram we put in the paper. So you have fundamental awareness giving rise to space and time, which gives rise to the quantum foam, which gives rise, and all the subatomic particles, to atoms, to molecules, to aggregates, cells, bodies, ecosystems in the biological realm. That's why it's green. But also larger scale structures, planets, solar systems, galaxies, galactic clusters, galactic filaments, the entire universe. And at least in string theory and a few other models, the math that describes the smallest describes the largest. And so we drew this as a circle. And before I published the paper, but it was in press, Joel Primack was giving his talk. I can't remember whether it was him or Nancy had showed the picture of the Ouroboros. Did they use that this morning? Which one used it? He did, yeah, I thought so. I saw that and I was like, oh my God, that's our diagram, because I'd never heard of an Ouroboros before. So that's our version of an Ouroboros. So that's the general model. So the way all this snapped into something more than just these mechanical sort of details, for geeky details for me, is I'm a Zen student, as I mentioned, for about 30 years now. And it used to be my job to open the Zendo on Thursday mornings, and back in the early days of the Zendo, often no one would be there, so it would be me sitting alone Thursday at one end of the room, and at the opposite end was the altar with a stick of incense. And that was when I was doing my stem cell research, and I was really deeply caught up in the work and the fact that what I was studying was myself, that I have stem cells, not just the mice I was working with at that point, that were also looking in humans, but I have stem cells. And the more I did that, the more self-referential got, it would sometimes become difficult to cross the street, because how do you move a leg that's a community of cells? And I would find myself freezing. And I was sitting in the Zendo and looked up and saw the incense stick and saw the smoke rising and became acutely aware that I was watching the solid object turn into the dust of the smoke. And I suddenly felt my body as this thing which was also made up of smaller things. And it occurred to me that, is that what they mean by emptiness of inherent existence in Buddhism? That they talk about a lot, in Zen particularly. And so I took this to my teacher, and I said, is that what they mean by emptiness of inherent existence? She goes, yeah. I said, that's not such a big deal. She said, who said it was a big deal? So as I said, there's the aspect of we don't live in the universe. The universe isn't an empty box. It's not a place in which we live. We are arising from its substance. We are the universe. And that is what we mean in Buddhist terminology in terms of the realm of the relative, this level of scale where we're separate objects and we think the universe seems like a space, and the absolute, in which there's this perfect, seamless, indivisible, non-dual, indescribable oneness, the Buddhaverse that Robert Thurman was talking about. I'll put my toe down and you tell me if you see the Buddhaverse. How many of you were at Thurman's talk yesterday? All right, so half of you got that, okay. So that thingness is dependent on scale. It's a thing at one level of scale. It's a phenomena arising from smaller things at another level of scale. That's emptiness of inherent existence. The inevitability of mass extinction events in a complex system, given enough time, is impermanence. That systems depend on every member. The emergence that will happen depends on every member. You change any behavior of any member, the potential is there for the emergent structure in its entirety to change. And this relates to the classical, the butterfly flapping its wings in South America gives you Hurricane Irma, potentially. That is what we mean by interdependence. And the fact that emergence is predictable, if a system of interacting individuals fulfills all those criteria, you have plenty of them, homeostatic negative feedback loops predominating, quench disorder, and no individual is monitoring where the entire system is, then you will have emergence, but you can't predict with precision what those emergent structures will be. That's karmic law, cause and effect. And so seeing the world as a self-organizing system from top to bottom gives you very easily a handle on all the basic principles of Buddhist metaphysics. What about these other traditions that we're familiar with, Mount Sinai? So in terms of the Jewish tradition, I was trying to think of, if you've heard of the 10-part structure of the universe, in the Kabbalah, the Sphirot, I was trying to figure out a way to turn this into something that maps to the Sphirot, but I wasn't sure, I didn't have an instinct for it. And there's an important rabbi, may he rest in peace, Zalman Schachter Shalomé, thank you. He's a Kabbalist that was accessible. He was in his late 80s at the time. He came out of the Lubavitcher movement many years ago, but he's essentially the founder of the Jewish renewal movement in the 70s, and like a serious modern-day Kabbalist. And I wrote to him and I said, I've got these questions. Could I talk to you about them? He said, sure, let's have a Skype schmooze. And I said, what's Skype? So he taught me. I had an 88-year-old Kabbalist tell me about how to Skype, and that was my first headset. And he said, no, it's not about the Sphirot. It's about the four worlds version of Kabbalah. So you have the Ein Sof, which is the infinite, undescribable, non-dual ground of being that gives rise to four levels. The first one is Atzilut, which translates as emanation. And isn't that kind of a perfect word for the idea of what's happening? The non-dual is emanating what comes above that. That leads to Bria, which translates as creation. And isn't that kind of perfect? We're actually creating the material structures of the universe out of those smallest non-material things. So we're up into subatomic particles. Formation, we now are actually forming objects that are bounded. And then the world of Asiya, you could translate it as doing or action, and that's all the stuff we see swirling around us in the universe. And so this seems to map really nicely. In the same way, in Vedanta, you talk about Brahman as the fundamental awareness, and those are terms in the texts, in Vedantic texts that refer to Brahman, and that gives rise in a complementary way to Ishvara, these realms. It's a similar sort of thing, and there's more detail about that that you can parse out. The interesting thing here is these structures and processes solve the paradox of how what links us to the divine is simultaneously what obscures the divine. And this has always been, when I started reading about Kabbalah when I was a kid, this was one of the things that, like, if this is the ladder to connect me to God, and yet it's the thing that keeps me from seeing God, how does that make sense? This is how it makes sense. It's all a matter of perspective. They're not concealing, it's just we're choosing one perspective or another. And whenever you choose that perspective, it veils the other perspectives, so you can't see them. It doesn't mean they're not there. And if you follow it, changing your perspective in a flexible way, and that's what a lot of contemplative practice is about, is developing that flexibility to move through different perspectives. So these are 2 slides from Minas, because this is the Shaiva stuff, and this is maybe the most important stuff that I will not explain to you today, because this is his realm more than it is mine. But it leads us somewhere important. So each of these different contemplative or mystical cultures, they were asking different questions. So the question in Jewish mysticism in that school, Luriana Kabbalah, was, how does the world come into existence? How did God create the world? That's the question. In Buddhism, the question is, what is the nature of suffering and what do we do about suffering? And so depending on the question you ask, you might get different formulations coming out of it. In Shaiva's thought, the question was, how does the non-dual turn into the universe of duality, of subject-object? And so they really, in their contemplative practices, were drilling down into that question. And this is the stuff, I can repeat what he said, I don't have a real visceral understanding of it, but it sort of makes sense that you start with the non-dual, where I and this are not separate from each other. They're the same. They're virtually identical. There is no object-subject. There is no self and other. It's non-dual. There's complete overlapping. They're slightly separated because now we have words, but there's really no distinction. And this is coming from the, basic Shaiva's thought. Then you start to have separation. The first step is I, this. There are now 2 objects, but they're still identified with each other. They're not separate. But I, and then am, to give a verb for our language, this. Then it sort of inverts. This am I. Still an identity. They're not separate. They're not subject-object. But then we go a step further, and we start to get separation, and I says, I am this, and this one is distinct from this. This took me a long time to get clear from him, because now there is a recognition that there is a separate this that I also am. And then you have complete separation. I am not this. And you have these sort of veiling principles that we talked about that I could demonstrate in the other systems that come into, so that this becomes obscured. And there you have a subject-object split. And as I said, then you can describe it in terms of, to have subject and object, self and other, you need some sort of space between them, some sort of separation in space and time, and then you have space-time, and then you have an energy-rich field, and E equals mc squared, and the whole thing springs into existence. Isn't that easy? So this is all, notice how casually I'm sitting here holding forth on all this stuff. These are all really nice, pretty ideas. It's just a framework, because, so what? I've just lined up all these ideas together and said, oh, there are parallels here, there's nothing more than that. It doesn't become a theory or a model until you've actually mathematized it. And so that's been Minas's project for the last year and a half. And this paper just got accepted for publication. It's posted on the web. It hasn't actually been released yet, published yet, with Goro Kato. And they're using a form of mathematics called sheaf theoretic formulation, sheaf topology, formulation for consciousness and qualia and relationship to the idealism of non-dual philosophies. So let me read this abstract to you. Ultimately, the ontological foundation of such systems is the absolute division of subject and object, scientific sort of stuff. We advocate instead what we consider to be an approach that is in agreement with the foundation of quantum reality, which is based on Ramanuja's version of Vedanta philosophy and non-dual Kashmir Shaivism. Quantum mechanics, so they actually published a scientific paper where they said, we're mathematizing non-dual theories from the Indian subcontinent, which in and of itself is cool. So quantum mechanics opened the door to consciousness, the plot quote I gave you upstairs, but it cannot account for consciousness. However, the quantum measurement problem implies that we cannot remove subjective experience from the practice of science. It is then appropriate to seek mathematical formalisms for the workings of consciousness that don't rely on specific interpretations of quantum mechanics. Temporal topos, this is a form of mathematics that I don't understand, provides such a framework. In the theory of temporal topos, which we outline here, the difference between a subject and an object involves the direction of a morphism in a category, etc., etc., etc. We also discuss the implications of the mathematics presented for the convergence of science and non-dualist philosophies as an emerging science of consciousness that may bring out the underlying unity of physics, life, and mind. So, which is very nice. Read the paper. It's harder to understand than the Barbara McClintock book. But there are some neat things. And now we get to the Vienna Circle. So, the Vienna Circle was a group of philosophers in Vienna in the 20s and 30s who were dedicated to the idea that the only things that were demonstrable and worthy of discussion by philosophy or science were those things that could be elucidated through empirical observations, scientific method, or could be deduced in formal logical systems. And so if you had a logical mathematical derivation of something and could prove it was true, that was real. If you could do a scientific experiment and make observations to support a hypothesis, those were true. But anything else that you couldn't do that with was not only could not be taken for true, but was not even worthy of discussion. And that would mean all of metaphysics. Their basic program was to remove all the metaphysical stuff from Western thought. The thing is that's weird about this to me, and I need to read deeper to sort of get a better grip on it, this was happening while quantum physics was happening. With empirical science itself was now saying, it doesn't work like that. So there was a strong reason for them to be wrong. But so why are they important to us? And the reason is because of Hitler. So Hitler, the Nazification of academics in Vienna began before Hitler and the Anschluss, Germany taking over Vienna in 1938, Austria. There was already an assassination of a member of the circle by a crazy person. And so at that point, people realized our lives are in danger, at least informally, and started finding positions outside, mostly in America and the United Kingdom, in the English-speaking world, often at leading institutions. And with the Anschluss, everyone else left. And they all found positions in major departments of science and philosophy of science throughout the West. And so the scientists who were raised in those institutions were being taught by the logical positivists who said the only real thing you can study is what you're studying in the laboratory. And that became, you have quantum physicists who say things like, of course the world is material. But you're a quantum physicist. I mean, how do you say that so blithely? And they've never heard of the logical positivists, but that's who they're talking about. So maybe the logical positivists were right. Turns out they were definitively wrong. And that was because of Kurt Gödel, who was a little bit slightly crazy, young philosopher, mathematician, logician, who was sitting in the back benches of the rooms that the Vienna Circle was meeting in. He didn't talk very often, if at all. And people thought, well, you're in this room, you're a logical positivist, and you're buying the whole thing. Rebecca Goldstein has written a really beautiful book called Incompleteness about his story. That's the easiest, straightforward layperson's way into this that I've read. So he was basically a Platonist. a mathematical Platonist. He felt that mathematical truths lay outside the realm of the human mind, that they predated or were the ground of being out of which things arise. And mathematical intuitions were a way to mathematical truths, where proofs might not be. The logical positivists said, no, there's no place for intuition. We want to derive a system of mathematics that's a formal structure of logic from which you define all of mathematics and thereby everything in the universe in a rigorous, mechanistic, mechanical fashion. Then he came up with the Incompleteness Theorems. And what they proved in a kind of extraordinary way is that if you have a formal system that includes arithmetic, which becomes important a little bit later, if you have such a formal system, then it will necessarily be either incomplete or inconsistent. If it explains everything, it will necessarily contain a statement that contradicts another statement within the proof. And if you have two contradictory statements in a proof, then it's no proof, because from those contradictions you can prove anything. So you can't have a complete system. More importantly, if you have a consistent system, there will always be truths about the system that cannot be proven from within the system. So the system is here, but there's this truth over here. And what he did was he played on the idea that any such system which gives rise or contains arithmetic will necessarily have within it a statement such as this statement is not provable within the system. If it's true, then the system is not provable, then the system is consistent but incomplete. But if it's false, then it's complete or inconsistent. And you get into this sort of self-referential loop that you can't get out of. And so by doing this, he showed definitively that it is impossible to fulfill the mission of the Vienna Circle. There will always be things that cannot be contained by a formal logical system. So they were wrong. And yet their view is what predominates in our culture. If you go back to World War I era and before, people were not so rigid that the only thing that could give you truth is science. That was a very flexible idea until we got to these folks, largely. Now the other thing is that Gödel's theorem then implies, oh, doesn't that sound like complementarity? If you structure your perspective, your proof, your system this way, there will be things that are true that you can't see from within the system or prove from within the system. If you change your view, your approach, your proof to contain that, oh, you've lost something over here. Is it two faces or is it a vase? So this is kind of the mathematics of complementarity, which made me think initially when I first was working with all this stuff, oh, is there a proof is this an alternate way towards a proof of Gödel's theorems? Probably not. Wrong intuition. But what does seem to be the case is, I talked to Menas about his mathematics, and I said, does your sheaf topology, can you derive arithmetic from your sheaf topological description of the non-dual becoming the dual? And he said, he hasn't done it yet, but he said, yeah, I think so. Why are you asking? I said, because if it does, then Gödel's incompleteness theorems apply to the nature of the universe. And that's what we mean by complementarity. And that's why complementarity is through from the ground of being all the way up, and you can't escape it. It is, what he was describing was the very nature of existence. So that's number one about Gödel. Number two, about the math. In talking to Menas over the last year and a half, one question we keep asking, and there are no consistent answers within any of these systems of thought that we're aware of. There seem to be contradictions within all of them. The question of, you have the ground of being, the non-dual pure awareness, fundamental awareness, you have that. Does it necessarily have to emanate existence? Or could it just sit there, being aware and chilled out? I think Bob Thurman asked this yesterday too. And I think he said, yes, it could. because some systems of Buddhist thought say, yes, it can. Some say it can't. And so there's no clarity about this. And I've been gnawing on this. And then part of the issue is, for me, I've been using this two faces in a vase image as the model for complementarity. And you could choose to only see the vase. You could choose to only see the two faces. So while there's complementarity there, you could choose to ignore it. Pure awareness could just stay pure awareness. There's no imperative that it has to make that flip. But then I thought, well, maybe that's not a good image to use for understanding complementarity. And what came to mind was a Mobius strip. So you have a strip of paper. I should have brought a strip of paper. And you make a link with it. It has two sides, and you can say those two sides are in complementarity to each other. You're either on one side or you're on the other side. And if you're on one side, you stay there, and you go round and round and round. If you're on the other side, you go round and round, and you just stay there. But if you make a Mobius strip, you put one twist into it, then as you travel around the Mobius strip, it looks like there are two sides, but there's in fact one side. And no matter where you go, it always leads you to the other side, which is in fact not another side. I thought, is that actually a more precise way to look at complementarity? And if it is, then the non-dual has to necessarily, there's a propulsive energy to that kind of structure. Wherever you are, it's going to lead you to the other, necessarily. So I asked Minas, does his mathematics, its topology, which is one of the ways to think about it is it's describing the geometric structures in space. I said, does your mathematics define complementarity as a Mobius strip or some similar sort of structure? And again, he's working on it, but his instinct is, yes, it does. So that would suggest that the universe exists because it has to. The nature of duality, non-dual awareness becoming duality is this self-propulsive thing. The two are always interlocked together. You can't have one without the other. If you have one, it necessarily generates the other. So that's another place that we're going with this. A third place we're going with this, where I would like to go with this, is it seems like this structure implies that as you have this self-organizing universe from pure awareness all the way up, does it necessarily have to give rise to interacting things? Or could the quantum foam just give rise to things that don't interact with each other? That would seem to not be the case, given that these things are not separate from each other. We're in the quantum realm, so everything's entangled, Does that necessarily have to give rise to living beings? And so does the math that we're starting with here give rise to a kind of creative interactivity, sentience, necessarily? And one of the things I'm interested in, and you might get insight going to Catherine Peel's talk tomorrow and Stu Kaufman's talk tomorrow afternoon, I'm giving you a shout out, that my proposition is that maybe the mathematics that might describe what Stu is going to talk about tomorrow, could that derive from the mathematics we're putting here? And so the system might say that in fact a universe that's arising has to be sentient and has to give rise to living things. But that's high-hanging fruit down the line. So that's where we are with all this so far. So that's the wisdom part. And another way of saying, well, what are you perceiving? What's the nature of reality? It's really a question of who or what are we? So at this level of the scale, we're this bounded little dot. Go down a level of scale, and the boundary gets wider. Your cells are being left around. We're part of shared microbiomes, etc. You go down a level of scale, we're in the molecular realm. We're breathing in what the plants have given us to breathe. We're breathing out what the plants need to breathe in. The atomic scale, what I said about the earth upstairs. Every atom in our bodies we either drank it, created or breathed it from the planet. So we are the Earth that has self-organized. Our boundaries at the atomic scale are at least as wide as the planet and encompass each other at that point. And then you're down into the quantum realm when you go lower, and then where's the boundary? There is no boundary. So what does this mean about the nature of living beings? And Bob Thurman yesterday was quoting extensively from the Vimalakirti Sutra, which was actually the text when I became a senior student at the Zendo. That was the text assigned for me for that process. And this was my favorite quote from the book. Manjushri asks Vimalakirti, how does the Bodhisattva regard living beings? Vimalakirti replies, as a conjurer looks on the beings he conjures up, thus does the Bodhisattva regard living beings. As the wise view the moon in the water, or a face or form seen in a mirror, as shimmers of heat in a torrid season, as foam on the water, as the tracks of a bird in the sky, as sights in a dream after one has wakened, so does a Bodhisattva regard living beings. We want to see ourselves and see others as such solid, reified objects that we have feelings for or against and have to organize around, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the things we all keep referring to all weekend. But how, with this kind of wisdom, how do you see living beings? We're shadows, we're dreams. And my mom actually, when I said to her, what's it like being 88? She said, you know, I look back and everything seems like a dream. I wonder, did it even happen? So that gets us to the compassion question. Boundaries are where one gives and receives. If I want to give you something, or you want to give me something, it's because we're separate and we can pass something across that boundary. So boundaries are where giving and receiving happens. But in complementarity to that, there's this. In the realm of the boundless, there's nothing to give and nothing to receive. What's compassion? Thank you.